Implementing and tracking semantic markup with Google Tag Manager.
Hi.
That's
Everybody
like we
had
want to do
fun?
this with, like, geek.
Oh, great, right? It's like really good.
This is super cool.
I'm like humbled and excited and honored to be part of this awesome lineup because like I'm learning a ton, and I don't know about you guys. I don't always learn at SEO conferences anymore, but this is like I'm just like
Humble brag.
I got takeaways. Yeah, hashtag humble brag. So yeah, let's talk about. I get to drive. Today we're going to talk about implementing semantic markup using Google Tag Manager and JSON-LD as opposed to inlining it. So quickly, let's talk about the case for semantic markup. Figure most of you guys know this, but just to review, at this point, really be an SEO 101 thing. It should be something, you know, like a title tag level thing that you look at when you look at a website. Every website at this point should have at least a basic level of markup, breadcrumbs, organization, et cetera, because it's an incredibly useful way to help search engines find and extract the data from your website. So instead of letting search engines and robots kind of infer based on context clues what a piece of information is on your website, which they're good at, semantic markup allows you to say explicitly, hey, here's my address, here's the street number, here's the town, here's the zip code, and that saves them time and allows them to do more things with the data. Semantic also is the chief thing that is driving rich snippets, which I'm sure you all have seen. You getting a picture or a little bit of rich data within your search results. You can get rich snippets without semantic markup, and it's a lot easier to get them if you have them. And what rich snippets are starting to evolve into, especially on mobile, are rich cards. And a rich card kind of takes the rich snippet experience a step further, pulls in a whole little packet of data that's isolated there in the search results that you can even then scroll through without scrolling up or down. It's really cool. But we're starting to see search engines doing more and more to extract data. And they're using semantic markup in part to figure out how to extract that data. So if what you're doing is creating an experience that machines can look at and take pieces of data out and serve it up to users, which is what SEO is, semantic markup is a hugely useful tool to be able to do that. And what we're starting to see is not only are search engines taking pieces of data from individual websites and serving them up in the SERPs. What we're starting to see is search engines taking pieces of data from multiple sources and combining them into rich entities. And a great example for this is menus. So I'm sure you've a menu come up when you Google a restaurant. This is the menu for Cattleman's, which is my favorite steakhouse in Oklahoma City. You can see that it features their famous lamb fries. What's lamb fries? It's Rocky Mountain oysters, but lamb. So it's an Oklahoma institution. This is the menu. This is not driven from their website. You know how I know? Because their menu on their website is PDF. However, this entity is taken from menu aggregator services, which are pulling out that information, marking it up in extractable ways. At this point, Google is smart enough data, link it back to this entity, to Cattleman's, and then drive you to the website based on this menu. So this is information that they're not getting from the website that they can still pull out, mash up, and drive you back to the website, increasing your experience of that brand if they think that's a useful experience for the users. So really, the way that I like to think about technical SEO is what we're trying to do is create machine-readable equivalents of human-readable quality signals. Semantic SEO is a really great way to do that. So, Mike, what is new with semantic markup these days?
Oh, there's a lot new. We'll be talking about structured data in terms of how that's evolved as a vocabulary. One of the things I like to also take a moment to point out is structured data is generally what we're referring to, and semantic markup is kind of like the tool that we use to create structured data. So schema.org is the source of all kind of structured data vocabulary, at least in terms of what we currently use. There's a lot of other secondary and tertiary vocabularies out there, but of course schema is the name of the game and the one that is supported by both Google and Bing and the other engines that we all know and love. So we had a new version of schema.org that was released recently. They had Notably, they expanded the course vocabulary, so if you're a college and you offer courses, there's a lot of cool new properties there. One of the things that I'm most excited about is I've always been fascinated by the idea of leveraging the rich snippets we've always had for recipes from like way back in the day and using that in applications that aren't food related. So like, okay, we got a how-to or like a DIY thing, like we should mark that up as a recipe. That would be super cool. As of Schema 3.3, we now have a how-to markup, so a more generalized application of that tried and true recipe markup. So that's really cool stuff. Just a couple of the kind of quick highlights from that release happening on a fairly regular basis, a couple times a year. So this is a great thing to keep up with. Job-rich snippets and occupational information, such as salary ranges, is something that Google has now rolled out. So they refer to this as actually as a searching experience. They call it the job search UI. It's entirely powered by structured data and semantic markup on sites. So if you are presenting information on your site, like you're hiring, you have a lot of positions open, regardless of whether or not you use an application tracking management solution, or you're putting your own homegrown job pages on your site, you can enable those with semantic markup so that they're going to be in this rich, immersive experience within Google search. And also, if you are publicly sharing salary range information, you can provide that data to Google so they can round out the information that they're able to extract from across the web, which is really cool. And this is big for me because, of course, throughout this talk, we are going to be kind of giving the business to inline markup and advocating pretty strongly for JSON-LD markup as the new method of choice for implementing this kind of stuff. Google recently changed their terminology on Merchant Center to say, hey, actually, we recommend you not only use structured data, but use JSON-LD as the preferred method to implement that structured data on your site. So that's a huge. We're going to be talking a lot about the benefits of JSON-LD, why it makes your life as a marketer and an SEO so much easier. So this is awesome to just kind of tip the scales a little bit to see that this is becoming part of paid as well as SEO organic. And then everybody at UpBuild is a big fan of podcasts, so this was an exciting one. This is kind of showing that it is not just JSON-LD. There's a lot more to it than just one specific type of format or style of markup. So this uses RSS2 to mark up content about your podcast in an RSS feed. We're going to be able to provide structured data to Google that they're in Google Home. So if you talk to your Google Home device or just Google Assistant, you have a Pixel phone like I do, you can tell it to play the latest episode from your preferred podcast, and it's just going to fire it up. It knows the URL for the player, for the audio file, the description of that episode. It knows which one the latest one is, and you can go and navigate back and forth to what's the episode before that and what's the overall podcast that this is a part of. You can get all that information if you're delivering it to Google via RSS2 structured data markup.
As a side note, the podcast example in this slide is the Adventure Zone, a podcast that Mike and I are both obsessed with.
Highly recommended.
If you like Dungeons and Dragons and you haven't listened to the Adventure Zone, I recommend it. If you don't like Dungeons and Dragons, it's still great.
It is. And I'll note that I'm not caught up with it because we were working on this presentation, so be very grateful. We made a lot of sacrifices for this. First click free is kind of going the way of the dodo. But we are seeing some interesting markup. Like I generally just hate paywall content and subscription sites, but it is really interesting to see what Google is doing in terms of wanting structured data about how paywalls are going to operate on your site if you're choosing to go that route. So you actually will tell them not just that your site has paywall content, but like, hey, this is an article, and it's you're actually going to be able to say now, or you are able to say now rather, that this is an article and this specific section is paywalled. So you can say like, here's the free section that's like the first 6 paragraphs of our content, and then everything within this div with this unique ID or class in CSS notation, you can say that's what's paywalled. So Google knows without having to suspect that you may have some cloaking issues going on and all that kind of stuff we want to avoid. And of course, we have been noticing that Bing seems to support JSON-LD now. Of course, throughout the course of this conference, we've started to hear that actually, yeah, Bing is doing a pretty good job these days. JavaScript overall, not just JSON-LD. So this is really, really cool because Bing was kind of, for us, the last holdout to say like, okay, well, maybe we still need to do inline microdata markup as a fallback in case we need Bing traffic to, or we need Bing to be able to pick up on our rich snippets. We can't just focus on Google. But now everybody's coming to the party and we can just worry about JSON-LD, which is really exciting. And if you do want to stay up to date on the latest and greatest in the world of structured data and semantic SEO, Aaron Bradley, who's like the godfather of structured data, compiles this great list. It's just, it's not the easiest thing to look at, but it's a good up in the cloud, and he logs every single little thing about like, here's how something improved for the world of structured data, and here's like the discussion URL, and here's the announcements, and here's the Help Center article in Google. Really good stuff. So if you want to stay up to date, that's a great thing to monitor. Cool. And I'll hand it back over to you, Ruth.
Oh, okay. I thought you were doing this part.
Sorry.
And then one of the main reasons why we're especially excited about semantic SEO as an industry lately is that it's becoming increasingly clear that structured data is a big part of what is driving voice search. Again, when we think about the ability of search engines to extract pieces of information from a web page, which is a data is designed to help them do. That extraction of data is basically what's driving voice search. So as you start thinking more and more about the performance of your website in voice search, thinking about the ways in which your data is marked up so that it can be easily extracted and delivered by a voice assistant or even by a smart device, things that are not necessarily browsers, but can still extract pieces of information. This is a huge reason why semantic markup and structured data continue to be important and are probably getting more important rather than less. So let's talk about JSON-LD versus inline. JSON-LD markup, JSON-LD, this is Tech SEO Boost, you know what JSON-LD is. Basically, what it allows you to do is create a little script and pull out all of the pieces of information that you need, which is great. It's very handy. You can all just write it out all in one spot. It also allows you to include pieces of information that aren't necessarily on the page, which is great because sometimes Google structured data testing tool wants you to have pieces of information that don't make sense for you to have on the page. My favorite example being that the web application markup, they want you to include what operating systems that application is. A web application, so what? But with JSON-LD, you can just like put in operating system and then every browser you can think of, and hey, you got that piece of information. But it would be dumb to include that on the page because it doesn't make sense. So JSON-LD is really great for including stuff like that. It also allows you to really nicely nest pieces of information that maybe aren't as well nested on the page. So all of your address information can be right under place. That's great. You know, sometimes your, excuse me, wow, that was loud. Sometimes your phone number is not actually by your address on your page. This allows you to have it all nice and put together. Inline markup, on the other hand, involves adding individual item scope and item type and item prop tags to the HTML tags that are already encasing those pieces of information, which is, I mean, what that means is that if something's crawling the page, that information, here's what this piece of data is, that structured data is right next to the piece of data that it's marking up, which is cool. But it does mean that anything you want to mark up has to be on the page. And it can also be difficult if the pieces of information that are supposed to go together within a schema are not actually all in, for example, the same div tag. And historically, I think we've all done span tags and like invisible styling and things like that to try to get everything in the same tag. It's pain in the patoot, but it's hard coded, so it is in there. Inline markup is easy to break for many of the reasons that I just talked about. If you change something, change the layout of your page, sometimes something's no longer within the same set of tags that it was, it's really easy for your inline markup to no longer work. And Mike actually has a really great solution for this if you are doing inline markup.
This post on Moz that you can head over to if you want to follow that link talks about two fairly little known attributes called item ref and item ID. One is for actually linking completely separate and well-formed entities with each other to form one kind of mega entity. So if you have an event, you have Catalyst as an entity who puts on the event. You have speakers, Ruth, Burr, Reedy, and Mike Arnesen, who speak at the event. Those are entities, so you can link those with one of those. And then I believe it is item ID for specific micro properties. So if you're filling out item props for your inline markup, you can use that. And that allows you to actually link things across source code, which is kind of cool. So you can get around it, and there's ways we can fix this. But the question we kind of need to start asking these days especially is, we can fix it, but should we? Is that even something we want to invest our time in?
I would say no. So I find this slide hilarious because every time I say JSON-LD, my husband's like, Jason-LD? I love him.
I'm from Portland, I don't get that reference.
I'm from Oklahoma, I do. The JSON-LD is it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot easier. It allows you to group all of the pieces of information that you're marking up in one place. It removes the necessity of doing, okay, my organization markup's over here, and my publisher markup's over here, but I need to refer to that. So using the item ref and item ID with JSON-LD, you can simply create a simple script that has all of your pieces of data and all of the attributes and mixes them all up, and it's really easy, and it takes a hot second to do. It's very fast, it's very clean. And it works just fine. At this point, both Google and Bing are perfectly capable of crawling JSON-LD and of extracting it. We're even seeing in Bing some of the rich results that are being driven in Bing. Increasingly, those pages that they're getting those results are doing so solely with JSON-LD without a concurrent inline. So really, it's easier, it's faster, it's cleaner, it's more pleasant to do. It's just better in every way, IMO. It allows you to be a lot more organized. So again, sometimes the pieces of information that you have on a page are not organized in a way that is how the schema that is for that information type is set up. So that can make it really hard if your pieces of information don't actually nest nicely within each other in your HTML code to convey to a search engine that these pieces of information are related. With JSON-LD, it's very easy to do, and you just kind of do it. Hard coding takes forever. Also, it requires that you have a level of access to the code that you may or may not have, depending on your relationship to your website, depending on how your website's set up, depending on your development setup. If you're having to submit a JIRA ticket every time you need to update semantic markup, and you're having to get that scheduled in with updates to like your product and critical security fixes and things like that, that can really, really push out your ability to implement this stuff. Using Google Tag Manager and JSON-LD, you can be a lot more flexible. And that also means that if something on your page changes, you don't have to go into that page, redo that code. You can instead just open up your JSON, change it there, and Bob's your uncle. So all of this, anybody who knows me knows that I love safety and being safe and feeling safe and doing things that are safe. I love it. I'm a seatbelt person. I'm very 10 and 2. If you want to be 100% safe, you might still want to do inline markup, because it is a way to make sure that if for some reason whatever machine that is crawling your website can't read the JSON-LD, they will still be able to tell what's going on. However, at this point, even I, a very incredibly safety-oriented person, agree that this is probably not the best use of my time. And certainly by the end of 2018, I don't anticipate that any of us are going to need to be hard coding or inlining anymore. Yay! So some people, I've heard some people say, well, Google supports JSON-LD now, but they might not in the future. Mike had a really good point about this when we were talking about this, which is, do you think that JSON-LD is for marketers, or do you think that it's for technologists? If we thought it was solely for marketers, the way that authorship was, I could see the argument that they might stop supporting it. But there are so many other applications of JSON-LD, and in much the same way that it's easy for us to update, it's also a lot easier for Google to extract. I've been wrong before. Nobody can see the future. I would be very surprised if support for JSON-LD by a major search engine, everything that they're doing indicates the opposite. So, take that with a grain of salt, because again, I can't see the future, but I'm not that concerned about it. So let's talk about implementation. There are two main ways that you can mark up data with JSON-LD. The first is pretty simple. You just create a script. You take all of the pieces of data and you say, here's this, here's this, here's this, and you just use the actual piece of information. So this is an example taken from the event page for TechSEO Boost. You can see we've got, okay, type, place, name, district hall, here's the address, here's the price, here's the website, here's the start date, the end date, and all of that we just take in the pieces of data. So you just write that out and into a custom HTML tag in Google Tag Manager. And then in order to get that to fire, you just trigger that on that landing page. So you can just say, okay, when someone accesses the TechSEO Boost landing page, fire this custom HTML script that will then run the JSON-LD and display it, and you've got that information. The problem with that is if you do it this way, like say I have 1,000 events, I don't want to write this same script 1,000 times. This guy knows what I'm talking about. So what we want to do instead, as always, is optimize this and make it more dynamic. So you, it actually looks like in the structured data in the snippet if you do it this way. What we want to do is find ways to extract pieces of data and get them into Google Tag Manager. Chris Goddard wrote this amazing blog post on Moz that you guys should all take a look at on how to do this, in which he shouts out to Mike. So we've got recursive shout outs going on now. That talks about how to extract the data. Fortunately, Google Tag Manager makes this really easy to do. So when you're setting up variables in Google Tag Manager, what's a variable? It is a piece of information with a name. That's all it is. You can actually pull out elements from as a variable type and pull them out. And you can do that using CSS selectors. So if, for example, your date or your time, or your, in this case, hero image, always has the same CSS selector on all of your event pages, you can say, okay, I'm going to create a variable. That variable is the event image, and I'm going to tell Google Tag Manager, okay, when you see the element selector, the CSS selector for this image, that pull in the data point, that variable, here's that image. And you can do the same thing with, here we've got all of the register now buttons have the same CSS title. So we can say, okay, any CSS element with this title, that is the register button. So you can sort of name your different data points. Now we've got something a little bit more interesting, because semantic markup requires that dates be in ISO, what's it called, ISO 9000, whatever. I can never remember what it actually is. The date format. But that's not how humans like to see dates. And as you can see, the date on this landing page is Thursday, November 30th, 2017. That's not how machines want to use it. So what you can actually do is set up just a simple JavaScript array that takes a look at the language and delimits it based on commas or spaces or however your pieces of information are separated. And translates those pieces of information into the correct format and then returns that as a string. So that's a way to get around that. The problem with that is if you just take those variables and plug them back into your GTM script, you're going to get something weird out that's not actually the data that you need to display. And now it's time for a breakdown.
So let's break down this script so you can see how this works. This will also be what you put into Google Tag Manager as a custom HTML tag rather than the static version that we talked about first if you were going to be okay with doing it 1,000 times over for 1,000 different pages. So this is intended to be a granddaddy of them all function to be on every event page in this specific use case. So what is actually happening here? The first thing that you'll notice is it starts off with a function in parentheses. And then at the end, actually, it ends that opening parentheses and immediately has another open and closed parentheses with document in it. There's a lot of technical stuff here that we can get into, but the short version is this is what we call an immediately invoked function expression, which just means that a function is defined here, and as soon as it's defined, it runs. So whenever Google Tag Manager loads this on the page, what it's going to do is run through everything in the middle section here and output a fully formed that's specific to that one page based on the data points that we feed in using Google Tag Manager variables. So the next section is something that strongly resembles the shell that we created by removing the different changing data points from just a basic example of JSON-LD for event type. This is where we will put in the references to our Google Tag Manager variables. If you are editing code within Google Tag Manager, as you would in this example, you can always access other variables within Google Tag Manager by putting double curly braces around the variable name. So those two white strings there are reference Tag Manager variables that are available from within the interface. So one thing to note, just like as an asterisk on this, is technically this is a JavaScript object. It's not actually the same thing as JSON-LD. If that's Latin, just ignore me.
Would you say that that's a semantic distinction?
I would say that's a semantic thing with some real implications, but usually it's not something you're going to have to deal with. The one use case where you might want to understand a little bit more about how objects work is if you had data points that may or may not show up on pages. So if you wanted to say, for example, cycle through every speaker that a physical speaker, but actually person speaker, on an event page and cycle through each one that was found on a page and progressively add them into this markup, you could do that. So, TechSEO Boost is going to have a lot more speakers than for like a small kind of evening after work event that has one featured speaker from here in town. So you could write a bunch of custom JavaScript to use that object notation to build this out.
Okay, we
but
got 4
I
minutes.
digress. The next part does something pretty simple. It just creates a script. So it creates a script tag, which is ultimately going to be the home of this JSON-LD file. The next thing is it sets a type, so application/LD. Don't ask me why it's not just JSON-LD, as it is everywhere else, but that's what it is. And then the next thing it does is start populating that blank script tag that's going to get added to the site with all of this data. You'll see the part there that says JSON.stringify and then data in parentheses. That means take that whole object that we wrote out up above and turn that into compliant JSON-LD markup. So that's how that works. And then the last thing, it references the document, which is just the web page you're currently on, and finds the head of the document and then appends that script to the end of the head so that you now have a fully formed page.
So then you just take all of that and you pop that into your Google Tag Manager, and then you can create this same custom HTML tag using the basic format that you already created using those variable names that you have already set up, and you set that to trigger on all of your event pages, and it's pulling in all of that information, and then we'll output it as a semantic markup and display that, and it'll totally validate in the structured data testing tool, and it's great. So what's awesome about this is you can mark up everything. If you have multiple entities on a page, you can mark them all. That you want to say that's not on the page, you can mark that up too. It's very powerful. It's incredibly flexible. The downside of it, as with many things with Google Tag Manager, it can get a little bit fiddly, especially if any of your pieces of data don't have great CSS selectors. If they're being populated dynamically themselves by another JavaScript thing, there's a lot of kind of testing and kind of fiddling with that can be necessary in order to get this to output the data that you wanted to output. So don't just you make use of the preview function in GTM, see if this is actually doing. However, we've found, so here you can see this is a screenshot from Google Search Console. We used this methodology to mark up every single blog post on a client site with the blog posting markup, and there's no inline markup on these pages at all, but Google Search Console has picked up every single one of them and is recognizing the blog posting markup. So it works, and compared to actually going in and editing their theme, which would have been a political nightmare in addition to being a coding headache, just being able to go into GTM and do this took maybe a fifth of the time that would have otherwise taken, which is great. So sometimes, Mike, you have a great idea and you talk it out to completion and you feel really good about it and you feel really smart, and then he does something that totally blows your mind. So, Mike?
All right, so I always like to push the limits, especially when it comes to semantic markup and Google Tag Manager, like my two favorite things in search marketing and marketing in general.
World.
So if you're not particularly code inclined and you're not comfortable with writing CSS selectors for all this data harvesting and stuff, you can actually start to turn Google Tag Manager into your structured data CMS. kind of a basic version of that. So what you could have is this really powerful variable within GTM called a lookup table. Is you feed it a piece of information, which is the page path of a page, and then you tell it what you want to output when it sees that thing that you feed in, when it has a match. So for this, we could actually, instead of saying like, okay, we're going to write CSS and complicated JavaScript to harvest every name of every event on a page, we can just put this all into Google Tag Manager and say, hey, for this page, Tech SEO Boost with just a trailing slash, the name is Tech SEO Boost 2017. If we go to the version that has dash 2018, the title should be this. And on down the line to the next example, you can have specified so you don't have to crawl that off the page. You just set it in Google Tag Manager. And then you go through the exact same process. And instead of using these DOM elements or custom JavaScript functions within Google Tag Manager, you just reference these tables that you kind of can manage over time within Google Tag Manager. So it's a cool kind of halfway solution that gives you the best of both worlds.
If you have a list of your pages and you have a list of the pieces of information on those pages, it's pretty easy with some copying and pasting to set up this kind of lookup table array.
Cool. And there's what that looks like. And this is a handy little flowchart for deciding which implementation method, because we fully acknowledge that not everyone is a good candidate for implementing JSON-LD via Google Tag Manager. Sometimes it's just like way easier and more scalable to have developers do it the right way, which would technically be interfacing with your content management system, with your database, and pulling those values that they already have stored, like in WordPress, for example, and outputting that as JSON-LD, just in a hard-coded version that updates every time the server gets requested. So there's better ways to do this, but as agency marketers that Ruth and I have both been for years, and people, Ruth has worked in-house at companies where it wasn't the most trivial thing to just go making changes to the doing this with Google Tag Manager gives you so much more flexibility and freedom, and never take for granted preview mode in Google Tag Manager, because you can try and try again and fail for the entire week, and you'll be fine, because preview mode lets you iterate on this stuff over and over again just within your browser. You don't have to push it out to the world until you have it right. And if anybody has further curiosities or just wants to get the rundown of this whole thing over again, you can go to that link up there, and that's a full blog post version of this talk, so you can reference that, and feel free to ask us any questions now and or later.
Hey, sorry, I just forgot my question. Do you know if, so you talked about like how you can indicate a section is paid. Mm-hmm. Do you know, you said you can see into the future earlier in the presentation.
I said I couldn't see into the future.
Damn, no, but do you know if they're gonna let you indicate anything else? Like for example, if content is in a modal or something like that?
It's my understanding of this, and Mike, feel free to disagree, is that this is specifically intended to address the problem of subscription and paywall content. So if they're going to extend that particular markup type to have broader applications, it's certainly something, I mean, if that's a schema that you're particularly interested in being created, certainly getting involved in schema.org and suggesting it as something for them to build out would probably be a good way to go about that. But I think this particular application is so focused on paywalls and getting around that problem that I don't think so.
Cool, good suggestion, thank you.
Yeah.
Come say hi later. We're really friendly and nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.